Well, thank you, Peter, and I want to extend my thanks also to Rowena, Christine and Heather from the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education. I've been very warmly welcomed and dined and wined last night, so thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to going to sessions today to hear about the work that you're engaged in student transition. I'm getting feedback on the mic, if I can just note that, which will distract me no end, I'm sure, and you maybe as well. I'm really enjoying this weather. It's like this all the time, isn't it? Please tell me if it is. I spoke to a colleague of mine telling them I was going to be here today, and they told me I should wear my best kilt. So I'm wearing my best kilt. I don't have one, so that's what I'm wearing. My plan is to talk for about 30 minutes and then leave some times for questions and discussion, which I think the question and discussion times are really important in these kinds of things because they enable me to hear the kind of things you're thinking about and indeed for you to hear what your colleagues are thinking about in relation to these matters. So that's my plan. Hopefully we'll stick to plan. I'm also working with a particular definition of transition, and I've put that up here in the overhead. Transition I'm understanding as the capability to navigate change. Now, two things about this definition. It draws attention to actors in transition, an individual, a group, an organisation. Transition is subjective rather than objective, and I hope to pick up on some of that bit later on. It also draws attention to a distinction between capability and capacity, and I think these are often used interchangeably, but incorrectly so. Arjuna Padarai, whose work you may know, makes this distinction when writing about the poor in Mumbai. He acknowledges Amartya Sen's use of capability to signal an individual's potential doings and beings, for example, to navigate. Padarai argues that the poor are more capable than others often give them credit, so much so that there needs to be a change in what he terms the terms of recognition of the capabilities of the poor. The issue is not so much whether they are capable, and the Padarai's research shows that the poor in Mumbai are very capable, in this case in designing and building a major public toilet facility for their community. The issue is whether they have sufficient resources or the capacity to do such things. Now, often the absence of capacity is interpreted as an absence of capability. The capabilities of the poor, or indeed other marginalised groups, are often assumed to be non-existent, or even when their capabilities are acknowledged, they are seen to be of less value. I think there are lessons here for us in terms of student transition. Invariably, students struggle with transition. Those who struggle are from marginalised groups. The problem is not simply theirs. The fact that they are concentrated in student transition programs should tell us that. Their capability to navigate change may not be recognised by education institutions, may not be valued compared to the navigational capacities of others, or may not be adequately resourced. They lack capacity. I also want to make two other points as I try to open up this discussion about student transition. Transition is not just experienced vertically, it is also experienced horizontally, and I hope that I'll unpack some of that for you. Students in transition do not just navigate changes over time, they also navigate changes within periods of time and across different spaces. And secondly, the change required for successful student transition is not just required of students, but also of institutions. Educational institutions, particularly our more elite ones, need to change to accommodate different kinds of students, yet some appear to be incapable of such change despite having the capacity for it. They struggle not so much with resources, but with rethinking the student experience of higher education given different students. So paying attention to the horizontal aspects of transition and to the need for higher education institutions themselves to change is fundamentally about social justice. Nancy Fraser has made a useful distinction, I think, between what she terms affirmative and transformative remedies for injustice. She has said that by affirmative remedies for injustice, I mean remedies aimed at correcting inequitable outcomes of social arrangements without disturbing the underlying framework that generates them. By transformative remedies, in contrast, I mean remedies aimed at correcting inequitable outcomes precisely by restructuring the underlying generative framework. The crux of the contrast is end-state outcomes versus the processes that produce them. It is possible then to devise programs to enable students to transition to higher education which can appear to be tailored to their particular needs, but without actually changing very much about higher education institutions themselves. The emphasis is on assisting students to change, and I'll say more about that later. And that's all by way of introduction to what I want to present to you today, which is research undertaken by Dr. Stephen Parker and myself and reported in 2014 in a journal article in a journal called Studies in Higher Education. I'm sure you'll be able to look that up. In that largely conceptual paper, we identified three kinds of student transition, which we called T1, T2 and T3. It was very inventive, don't you think? The research that informed our paper was commissioned by the Australian Learning and Teaching Council, which is now known as the Office of Learning and Teaching. The Council had been funding action research projects on student transition in Australian universities over a number of years and wanted these to be reviewed in order to determine the elements of what they called best practice. They supplied us with the full reports of 14 projects and 5 fellowships that they deemed to be about transition. And we also looked at 3 projects and 2 fellowships that were in progress. We were asked to review each of the projects and to provide an account of their methodologies, their outcomes, their resources and dissemination. And we also sought to identify what each contributed to the understanding of transitions. A second aspect of the report was a review of the national and international literature. We looked at 3 main categories of literature: youth transition and student transition in schools, so it wasn't just limited to higher education; descriptive and evaluative literature of current transition practices in programs in Australia, the US and the UK; and other literature that deliberately focused on theorising what transition means. In addition, we included some insights from social theorists such as Deleuze. One of our key findings was that transition as a concept is frequently taken for granted, with little explicit attention paid to what the term means. There is no agreed definition of what constitutes transition. The definition I'm using today, that transition is the capability to navigate change, is one that we've theorised in the context of our research and of relevant social theories. But in many practice-orientated studies, including the ALT projects reviewed in our report, transition is rarely explicitly considered, despite the fact that different conceptualisations and theories lead to different ideas about how to manage or support transitions. Unspoken ideas about transition have real-world effects. In context of practice, the word transition is used uncritically and without reference to the research and theoretical work that has been done on this topic, especially, we found, in Australia. It might be different here in Scotland. Whereas the more theoretical work on transitions, often outside the field of education, tends to contest the dominant assumptions inherent in the word transition and argues that many students do not fit into the mould implied by common transition practices. So one of the main contributions of our paper is the characterisation of 3 broad types of transition, 3 ways of conceiving of the change, which, as I said, we named T1, T2 and T3, and more on that later. While not always explicitly named in the research literature, it is possible nonetheless to discern these 3 distinct ways in which transition is conceived. We found that most of the programs tend to fall into the first two categories, while the third is more of a proposition. And although there is value in each approach, we argue that there is the most potential in T3 for practices and programs aimed at students from marginalised backgrounds. Now, informing our analysis was an observation by Basil Bernstein that educational knowledge is a major regulator of the structure of experience. And following this is a key question. How are forms of experience, identity and relation evoked, maintained and changed by the formal transmission of educational knowledge and sensitivities? In other words, we were interested in the full range of experiences of students in transitioning. So the first category of transition that we identified is what we term transition as induction, or sequentially defined periods of adjustment along pathways of inculcation. Doesn't that sound appropriately academic? Perhaps you need to let that sink in for a while. Transition as induction, or the sequentially defined periods of adjustment along a pathway of inculcation. Here the dominant metaphor is boot camp. In the T1 programs we analysed, transition is viewed as a risky time of infrequent periods of adjustment or crisis that are bounded by more stable circumstances or periods. The boot camp metaphor is most evident in the types of transition programs associated particularly with the first year of higher education, a period of intensive training to get the student up to scratch, after which they'll be all set. There'll be no problems after that. Implied here is a linear progression of students from a school or other educational institution into higher education. In the middle is a transition stage. It is linear, sequential, from one institutional and or disciplinary context to another. It focuses on students' experiences within higher education more than their prior and or concurrent experiences. The first year in higher education is seen as a critical time, and there are normative expectations of what constitutes a successful transition. T1 is system-serving and tends to be deficit-based. The focus is on what students lack rather than what they bring to higher education. Students are required to conform, and there are notions of successful and failed transitions. So this concept of transition has been popular in Australia in recent years, particularly expressed in so-called transition pedagogy. Here, the linear and in-through-out model can be seen in this example from the University of Newcastle in Australia. The emphasis in transition pedagogy is to provide timely and explicit advice and to help to guide students through the transitional period of the first year. Pedagogy and curriculum are aimed at regulating student behaviour in timely ways. Note the into, through, into, out, into list in the quote is a list of periods, not stages. The latter items in the list particularly indicate this with their focus on activity, not identity. Note also the reference to career attainment, not becoming a professional, or to continuous professional development, for example. The T1 conception of transition is seen most clearly in the principles of transition pedagogy, by which is meant consistent, explicit, timely teaching directed at helping students to fit in. It is a coordinated whole-of-institution approach. The assessment is aligned with subject and program aims and objectives. The pedagogy is aimed at shaping and making behaviours and expectations explicit. Transition pedagogy is intended to provide timely access to support which scaffolds and mediates the first-year learning experience. It is a pedagogy of induction, aimed at moulding students into established ways of being a university student, into an established academic culture. It is directed at regulating student behaviour and performance to conform to the current standard of higher education. It is not a pedagogy that is cognizant of which values different knowledges and or different ways of knowing. Who students are and what they are being inducted into are not taken into account. Instead, it is a pedagogy of regulation, of regulating bodies, through the use of instruments such as attendance records, assessments and feedback. These inductive pedagogies are not directed at enabling students to access disciplinary knowledge with an appreciation of different ways in which to do that, and it is certainly not informed by knowledge of the other. Its aim is to mediate diversity. A second conception of transition we identified is transition as development. Qualitatively distinct stages of maturation along trajectories of transformation. Another academic jargon-filled definition, but I think it's worth thinking about that. Transition is development, qualitatively different stages of maturation along trajectories of transformation. The dominant metaphor is life stage. T2 is similar to T1 in that it is linear and normative, but instead of periods of time, T2 is defined by stages of development. Stages in which individuals are transformed, for example, from childhood to adulthood, not strictly defined by length of time, but time is still needed nonetheless for transformation to occur. And the stages imply a shift from one identity to another, a stilted progression. In this model, the first year in higher education is seen as a time in which students develop their identity as a university student. There is also an interest in the development of students into something beyond being a student, developing their career identities to become somebody, a scientist, a lawyer, a professional, etc. Here we can see two common program examples of the T2 approach to transition, which emphasise the development process. Workplace learning or field placement education is seen in a lot of undergraduate courses, especially those that have a specific career or vocation as an intended outcome. For example, teacher education programs, the field I work in, have practicums or placements in schools from the first year. Other courses, such as social work and medicine, also have work placements. One of the purposes of workplace learning is to foster and develop learners or amateurs into professionals. It is often colloquially referred to in the field as learning the ropes. Another example of T2 transition is peer mentoring programs, known variously in Australia, the US and elsewhere as supplemental learning, peer-assisted study sessions and peer-assisted learning. In these situations, first-year students are given extracurricular support by latter-year students in subject areas that are deemed to be difficult. Part of the aim is for new students to better themselves and or improve their grades. This is where so-called experts teach novices about subject matter, study tips, etc. We see here a gradation of students. First year is novice, second year is teacher expert, and so on. This type of program is characterised by stages of identity, whereby the learners eventually feel more comfortable and competent to the extent that they, in turn, become mentors. There is also an emphasis on the developmental benefits for the mentors. Examples of being a mentor fosters desirable vocational skills that employers value. And indeed, students put these kinds of activities in their CVs when they go for employment. In both of these examples, the accumulation of cultural capital, whether academic or vocational capital, is associated with the development of identity. The linear stage development from novice to expert and amateur to professional are the primary forms of identity development undertaken by higher education. A third conception of transition is more of a proposition, particularly in the higher education context, which we developed in part in response to what we see as the weaknesses of T1 and T2. T3 is an appreciation of transition as becoming. It involves a fundamentally different understanding of student experiences and the nature of higher education. We define T3 as a perpetual series of fragmented movements involving whole-of-life fluctuations. The dominant metaphor is collage. It is informed by concepts from social theory, particularly from Deleuze, and not just from research in the field of student transition in higher education. T3 rejects the idea that life is linear, experienced in defined periods of time or stages of development, and even rejects the idea that transition is necessarily problematic or that crisis is problematic. Instead, it acknowledges and emphasises the messiness of life, the back and forth, in and out of higher education, the rhizomatic, zigzag, spiral movements, the fluctuations in lived reality and subjective experience, flexible timelines, study modes and pathways, the courses that engage with students' different histories and subjectivities, the fluidity of identities, the multiple narratives and subjectivities. People are never just one. For example, they navigate between identities of work, university and home life on a daily basis, and so do you. Now, we were unable to identify an Australian example of what T3 transitions might look like, so we've drawn together illustrative elements from different contexts to think about how it might work. Our first example is from University College Dublin. It's an example of the way in which program structures have been changed to accommodate the messiness of students' lives. These flexible systems are characterised by modular-based curricula, greater flexibility and choice in how and what is studied within a given degree. In this case, 12 modules a year, normally 6 per semester, but students can choose more or less as desired. Core, optional and elective models. The focus is on what students will learn rather than what material the lecturer will teach. Credits from modules in one degree are transferable to another. The structures allow you to buy in and out according to your life circumstances. Now, beyond a structural flexibility that is more sensitive and adaptive to students' lives, there are more fundamental changes that institutions can make to be more inclusive of diverse student populations and their everyday transitions. These ideas are derived from sociology and philosophy and call attention to the relationships between different types of knowledges. For example, the idea of epistemology, there you are, you'll probably say that 3 times fast. Epistemological equity is that equity is not just about numbers of proportional representation, about who gets into university. Instead, it is about what they get access to. For example, Sifa Day argues for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledges in higher education. Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous issues are very strong and important issues in Australia and other parts of the world, such as Canada and elsewhere. It's not as he argues that it shouldn't be a separate subject or a module or a course, but embedded throughout the curriculum. The broader point is that there are different forms of knowledge and that some forms are privileged over others, as are people associated with those knowledge forms. In a similar way, Raymond Connell's conception of Southern theory draws attention to the dominance of European knowledge in universities. Connell points out that the majority of social theory is essentially Eurocentric and excludes the insights of thinkers from the global south, or if they are included, the global north appropriates them without acknowledgement. A Southern theory of higher education brings together these two concepts, an attempt to transform what is taught in higher education as a part of a widening participation agenda in which more diverse groups of people, including those from disadvantaged backgrounds or areas of multiple deprivation, are entering higher education and are asked to subscribe to forms of knowing that are less familiar to them. The focus here is not only on Indigenous knowledges, but crucially working class knowledges as well. The understanding and worldviews of those students from areas of multiple deprivation that we wish to lure into higher education. And we heard about the recent report on widening access in Scotland that is attempting to do that, requiring universities in Scotland to be engaged in those kinds of activities. Finally, a funds of knowledge approach to higher education seeks to bring into classrooms the life worlds of those who have a different cultural capital to that of the educational institution. Instead of being a deficit, these different worldviews and ways of knowing become pedagogical assets. Such an approach is more common in schools and teacher education, but it is a relatively novel concept in relation to higher education. It is assumed that in higher education, the academy knows best. And even when terms of access are changing, the content of higher education is rarely challenged or expected to change. Instead, the usual expectation is that students are required to conform to the requirements of the institution in terms of procedural requirements, but also to higher education more generally in its curriculum, including adopting an identity as a higher education student. Many of the supports, programs, etc. of T1 require of the institution only to make their expectations more transparent for students, not to be reflective about what is taught or how, or the knowledge forms that are on offer. Now, a more concrete example of this idea has been developed by Christine Hawkins and her colleagues at the University of Wolverhampton, which they refer to as Connectionist Pedagogies. Connectionist pedagogies refer to an approach to teaching that seeks to increase student engagement through bringing into the classroom students' own experiences, beliefs, understandings, etc. The focus is on making class content relevant to students by connecting what they already know with the new material that is being taught. For example, teaching core principles using culturally relevant examples from students' own workplaces, homes, family life, etc. Discussions that allow students to contribute from what they know. Learning experiences that ground students' learning in ideas that have relevance to their lives. This isn't about dumbing down the curriculum, but a framework for inclusive teaching that enhances student engagement. It sits in contrast to a transmissionist approach in which learned lecturers stand in front of a class and bestow their knowledge on students in a unidirectional way. Exactly what I'm doing now. This table is from our article in the Journal of Studies in Higher Education. It shows how T1, T2 and T3 compare. T1 transition is focused on familiarisation activities and employs institutionalist transition pedagogies. T2 transition is focused on developmental activities and employs individualist transition pedagogies. And T3 transition is focused on flexible and diverse engagements with higher education and employs connectionist transition pedagogies. All these transition conceptions and practices have something to offer, but T1 and T2 place the onus on students to change, while institutions are encouraged only to make their expectations more explicit. T1 and T2, as they operate in practice, are largely system-driven and system-serving. T3 conceptions and practice embrace diversity, with significant benefits for all. As Millam has noted in his analysis of higher education in the US, when diverse students and their diversities are embraced within the formal transmission of educational knowledge, the educational benefits for all students include greater relative gains in critical and active thinking, greater intellectual engagement and academic motivation, and greater relative gains in intellectual and social concept, with the most gains recorded by the most advantaged students. Isn't that interesting? When we take account of diversity, there are benefits for all. So what are the lessons from all this teeing and throwing? We need to be careful to employ transition practices that recognise and resource students' capabilities to navigate change. And we need to recognise that students' capacities to navigate change often have more to do with their horizontal transitions, the often unacknowledged juggling of identities they do on a daily basis, than with their vertical transitions. And finally, education institutions need to change themselves. Just requiring students to fit in is a very narrow conception of education. Higher education itself needs to be reimagined to take account of different ways of knowing and different forms of knowledge. This is what is required if we are to change the underlying generative framework that Nancy Fraser refers to, which produces inequitable educational outcomes in our societies. Thank you.